Year 7, here's one for you on life in medieval England. Life in medieval England, medieval life. Okay, I'm going to talk about several features of life in medieval England that we've looked at this year and will hopefully be useful for you when you are revising for your exams, your end of year exam, which is next week. So, I'm going to start by talking about religion in medieval England. Now, we know that religion is very important in medieval England. In England or Britain today, there's many different religions, loads of different religions. Back in medieval England, though, virtually everyone believed in God, the Christian God, heaven and hell. Okay? Everybody nearly in medieval England believed in God, they believed in heaven, and they believed in hell. God and religion was used to explain things that people couldn't explain. Okay, there wasn't the scientific knowledge and know-how and technology that we have today, where we can explain things like illnesses and things like that. So things that people couldn't explain, they used God as an explanation. Why have we had a bad harvest? Oh, we must have done something wrong, and God must be punishing us. Or what is making us ill? Obviously, when you're revising the Black Death, that is one belief that people have, that God is punishing people with the Black Death because they have sinned, they've done something wrong. So again, it's a punishment from God. God is the reason for this happening or that happening. So it's used to explain things. God is used to explain things. Heaven was seen as the reward for living a good life, for being good. And hell was seen as the punishment for not living a good life, for being bad. So heaven is your reward for having a good life or living a good life. Hell is your punishment for sinning, for being bad, for doing things wrong. Because of all of this, because nearly everybody believes in God and heaven and hell, churches naturally became very important. Churches were the biggest and arguably they were the most important buildings in a medieval village or town. Yeah, they were definitely the most important building because people would use the church as a meeting place. They would use it as a place to go and pray, obviously, and to speak to their priest. We've looked year 7 at what the church has been used for in quite some detail. So it's not just used for a place to pray or a place to meet. It's also used for plays, if people come to put on a show, a play. It's used for summer fairs. It's used for, as I say, village meetings. It's used for a whole heap of things, not just a place to go and pray. Priests themselves, who obviously are in the church, acted as local advisors. So you'd go and speak to your priest if you needed advice on something. And they were also local leaders, I guess. They were the person who you would go and as I say, seek advice from and kind of look to for leadership. Priests would listen to confession. So if you had done something wrong, or you thought you'd done something wrong, you would go and confess your sins, your bad things, your things you'd done wrong, to the priest. So priests would listen to that, and that was a way of trying to get God's forgiveness, because hopefully the priest would say, you are forgiven of your sins. In church services, priests would advise the people who'd come, the villagers or the townspeople, on what to do to get into heaven. So here's what you need to do to live a good life. He'd also warn them about what they'd be sent to hell for. Remember as well that churches themselves are decorated with paintings or stained glass windows that kind of show hell and show the horrible things that happen there, or maybe show people doing bad things that get them into hell. So again, that acts as a warning, kind of a visual warning. The church was also given a tenth of the food that every villager grew. So 10% of everything you grew that year in your field, on your strip of land, you would have to give to the church or the priest in the form of a tax called a tithe. Okay, a tithe. You would give that to your priest, 10% of everything you'd grown. So obviously if you had a bad harvest, an awful lot of your food was going to the priest. People didn't really like that. And in year 8, we'll look at how this changes over time. But that's what people gave, what the villagers gave to their priest as a form of a tax, called a tithe. The most important person on earth to pretty much everyone in medieval England was the Pope. He was considered even more important than the king, because the Pope was seen by medieval Christians and by Catholic people today as the voice of God, God's representative on earth. So if the Pope says something, it's basically God's voice. God speaks through the Pope. So he is God's representative on earth. So whatever he says, obviously, is very, very important, which is why he is considered, as I say, more important than the king in many respects. We've looked year 7 in 1066 when William goes to the Pope and says, Harold has promised me the throne and he's broken the promise. When the Pope says to William, that's terrible, the Pope gives William his banner, his symbol, which William uses to go around Europe to get people to come and fight with him. Because if the Pope has said that war is okay, or that battle is okay, it becomes a holy war or a holy battle. So if you die in that battle fighting for God's side, the side that God has picked, and clearly God has picked William through the Pope, then you'll go straight to heaven. So, the Pope can overrule kings, really. I told Year 7 the other day that during the Battle of Hastings, many of the English soldiers, or some of the English soldiers, see the Pope's banner in amongst William's soldiers, and a lot of them go, oh my God, I'm really scared, and run away, because they think, well, God's against us, and you can't beat God, so we better run away, because we're clearly on the wrong side here. God is with William, he's not with Harold. So you can see that the Pope and religion is incredibly important to people in medieval England. Now, life in medieval villages is what I'm going to talk about next. Life in medieval villages. Now, we know that life in medieval villages for the peasants, or villeins, remember that word? Life for the villeins is incredibly tough. Okay, villeins would work in the fields from sunrise to sunset. They'd be working on their very small strips of land that they'd been given by the Lord in return for payment. They'd work those strips of land. Remember as well that the villeins also have to work a certain number of days a week for the Lord, free of charge. They do not get paid for that work, but they have to work for the Lord for a certain number of days a week, which they're not very happy about because they'd rather get paid for it. So they have a pretty rubbish and also quite hard life. Peasants or villeins usually lived in houses, small wood huts called crook houses. Each of these crook houses would have a small garden on the outside where the peasants or the villeins could grow vegetables or fruit or herbs. They'd be very small, so you couldn't grow a lot of it, but hopefully it'd be enough to feed you, keep you going, as well as what you were growing in the fields, of course, on your strips of land. They may have also kept animals, sheep, pigs, goats, chickens, again, animals that you can use the produce from, so the eggs from the chickens, the milk from the goat, and obviously you can eat the animals as well. So they keep those as well to feed them, okay? So they grew all their food. There wasn't, an Aldi or a Morrison's or other supermarkets were available. There wasn't a supermarket. They could not just pop down to the shops to buy their food. They had to grow pretty much all of it. They might occasionally be able to buy some from a trader, or maybe buy some from another person, another villager, another villain, but 99% of the food, pretty much, that they ate, they grew themselves on their strips of land or in their gardens. So if there was a bad harvest, they starved, they were hungry, okay, and they could even die. If their harvest is so bad that they don't grow anything, it's likely that they would starve, okay. So you can see again, pretty rubbish life. You're reliant on, lots of things, the weather and the harvest and your crops growing properly, and if they don't, it could mean death for you. So it's not a good life, not a good life at all. We've talked in class about who you'd like to be in medieval England. I don't think any of you wanted to be a villain. Most of you wanted to be, a king or a baron or maybe a knight. However, not all villagers in medieval times were farmers. We talked about this the other day, actually. Not all villagers in medieval villages were farmers. There were loads of other jobs. There were blacksmiths who obviously made shoes for horses, but other metal objects as well. Carpenters, so who carved things out of wood. Weavers, bakers, fishermen. There are many more, and you'll have them all written in your book, or you should do. Loads of other jobs in medieval villages. The majority of people in medieval villages were villeins and farmers, but there were other jobs as well. So that's medieval villages. Now I'm going to talk about life in medieval towns. Okay, now towns really began springing up in great numbers in England after 1066. Before William conquered England in 1066, there were only about 25 towns in England-ish, 25 towns. Okay, by the year 1400, there were 300 towns in England. So they really do spring up when the Normans arrive, and I'll explain why in a minute. Typical features of a medieval town, well, I'll say why they spring up in quite big numbers, is one typical feature of a medieval town was the castle. Now, as we know, when the Normans come to England, they build castles in great abundance. Castles spring up all over the place in England, particularly along the Welsh border and the border of Scotland and on the coast, and in areas where there are lots of people to keep an eye on them, stop any trouble. So castles spring up all over England. Many of the towns by 1400, the medieval towns, literally started off as a castle. The castle was there and there was nothing else. And then over time, the town has been developed around the castle. It's kind of sprung up from the castle and spread out. So a lot of medieval towns just start off as a castle and then are developed around the castle, and then they become towns as we know them. Towns had shops, lots of shops, where you could buy different things. There'd be signs on the outside of the shop with a picture of whatever it is they sold. So if it was a place that sold shoes, there'd be a picture of a shoe on the outside. So lots of shops where you could buy different things. Walls and defences around the towns. Most medieval towns had walls going all the way around the town for protection, in case they were attacked by whoever, by an invading army or by rebels from the countryside, or who knows. But there'd be big walls for protection around the town, as well as the castle. There were markets that would meet once or twice a week, so market stalls popping up with usually run by traders who had come from the countryside. So the local villages would go to the towns to sell their whatever it is they'd made or grown or what have you. And churches, of course. So every medieval town would have a church or even a cathedral, again, where people could go and pray and speak to their priest. And finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about, feature of medieval life, is having fun. Okay, because even though, as we've seen for the villeins in particular, life is not that fun, generally, people still wanted to entertain themselves in medieval England. Remember, Sunday was their day off. They didn't work on a Sunday. They also had holy days, so special saints' days or feast days, holy days. Obviously, that's where we get the word holiday from, because for these holy days, they'd have the day off. They wouldn't have to work. So they enjoyed those holy days, and on these holy days, or on Sundays, when they were amusing themselves and entertaining themselves, they would do lots and lots of different activities. You've got a ton of activities written in your book, and you should be revising that for your exam. But I'll just talk about a few of the things they did for fun. Number one, a lot of you found it very entertaining to look at medieval football, or mob football as it's become known. This was football with no rules, no referee, as many players on the teams as possible. Really, it wasn't 11v11. It could be literally hundreds versus hundreds. Villages versus villages. Usually, it involved kicking a stuffed pig's bladder from to the other village's green. Okay, so they'd be the goals. There'd be one village green and another village green, so two villages playing each other, and the goal was to get the ball or the stuffed pig's bladder to the other village's green before they got it to yours. So a bit different from the football that we all love today, or most of us love it. I certainly do. even though I do support Bradford City, so maybe I don't love football, who knows. Another thing that people in medieval England did for fun, or to entertain themselves, was archery. Now, as we looked at in lessons, we know that football, medieval football, mob football, was a lot more popular than archery. Okay, remember that men or boys above the age of 12 are instructed to practice their archery skills by the king at least once a week. To practice for a war. Okay, so if a war comes, England will have archers ready to fight in this war. So people would practice their archery, or men would practice their archery. But they found football a whole lot more entertaining. And the king, remember, actually banned football in 1331 because he said, look, men, you're not practicing your archery skills. So you play football instead, you shouldn't be. So you actually banned football by royal decree. But people carried on playing it anyway, because the king couldn't police the whole of the country. He tried to, but he couldn't. One other thing that I talked about very briefly in lessons was bear baiting, quite a horrific pastime for people in medieval England, where a bear would be chained to a post while dogs attacked it, and people would bet on who would win, the bears or the dogs. So that was a pretty nasty pastime, but people in medieval England seem to find it quite entertaining. There you go. There were loads more activities that you should have written in your book, and there's quite a few more written in the textbook as well. So make sure you get some of those in your head ready for the exam next week. So those are some features of medieval life in England. Hopefully that has been of some use to you. Again, make sure that you're revising properly, ready for the exam in case you do get asked a question or two on medieval England or life in medieval England. There'll be more videos coming over the weekend. Keep revising, and I will see you soon.